If I were younger, you'd already belong to me." I froze, my breath hitching. Those words came out of Michael's mouth with such certainty, such intensity, that I couldn't look away. His gaze held mine, unwavering, as if daring me to deny what he just said. I couldn't. My cheeks burned, my heart raced, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Let me tell you how we got here." It didn't start with this bold confession. No, it was quieter, almost innocent. At least, I thought it was. A few weeks ago, I found a note left on my terrace. It read, "Thank you for your smile. It brightens the world." My first reaction was confusion. Who would leave something like this? Then, I spotted Michael across the street, watering his garden, and I figured it must be him. He was my 81-year-old neighbor, always polite, always kind. I smiled, thinking it was sweet, harmless. The next day, there was a bouquet of lilies, my favorite flowers, on my porch. No note this time, but I didn't need one. How did he know about the lilies? That question haunted me all day, but I brushed it off as a lucky guess. Then, one evening, I opened my door to find another small gift, a beautifully wrapped box with chocolates inside. By now, my curiosity was piqued. I decided it was time to say something. I couldn't just ignore this anymore. "Michael, would you like to come over for tea tomorrow?" I asked him the next morning, catching him in his yard. His eyes lit up, and he agreed with a warm smile. The next evening, he arrived. Not in casual clothes. No, he wore a tailored suit, as if he were about to attend a formal event. His hair was neatly combed, and he carried himself with a confidence that felt timeless. I found myself adjusting my posture, suddenly self-conscious. As we sat in my living room, sipping tea, he spoke about his past. Michael told me about his late wife, how he had once been a musician, how he loved literature. His words painted pictures of a life well lived, yet tinged with loneliness. I hung on every word. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You've made me feel alive again, in a way I didn't think was possible." I stared at him, stunned. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. For the first time, I noticed the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the room. Like I was the only person in the world. My heart skipped a beat, and I hated myself for it. I wanted to say something, anything, but no words came out. Instead, I smiled awkwardly and excused myself to the kitchen. As I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, I tried to steady my breathing. What was happening? When I returned to the living room, Michael was waiting patiently, a soft smile on his face. He didn't push, didn't pry. But his presence filled the room in a way that made it impossible to ignore him. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I could convince myself that it was just a moment of misplaced emotion. But I was wrong. The next day, I found myself thinking about him constantly. His voice, his words, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. I couldn't shake it. And then it happened again, another note. This one was shorter, but it hit me harder than all the rest. "You deserve to be cherished every day." I felt something shift inside me. Was this still harmless admiration? Or was it something else entirely? That evening, I saw him sitting on his porch, reading a book. I hesitated before walking over. When he noticed me, his face lit up. "Michael, can we talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," he said, setting his book aside. I sat next to him, the cool evening air wrapping around us like a blanket. These notes, the flowers. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't flinch, didn't look away. "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "And because I can't help myself." My heart pounded in my chest. His honesty was disarming, almost terrifying. I wasn't prepared for this. "Michael, you're 81, I stammered, as if stating the obvious would somehow make this all make sense. "And you're beautiful," he replied, his voice calm, steady. "Age doesn't change that." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to run, to escape this impossible situation. But another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit existed, felt drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. I stood up abruptly, mumbling something about needing to get home. As I walked away, I could feel his eyes on me, and I hated how much I wanted to turn back. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words replayed in my mind, over and over. "You've made me feel alive again." I didn't know what was more unsettling, the fact that he said it, or the fact that I liked hearing it. The next morning, I opened my front door to find Michael standing there. My heart jumped into my throat. "Good morning," he said, holding a small box in his hands. I wanted to give you this. I took the box hesitantly, my fingers brushing against his. Inside was a delicate necklace with a simple pendant, a small, golden star. To remind you of how bright you shine, he said. My breath caught. I couldn't speak. I didn't deserve this. I didn't deserve him. Michael, I began, but he held up a hand. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. Just know that you're extraordinary. As he walked away, I felt tears sting my eyes. What was I supposed to do with this? With him? Michael's hand lingered on mine for just a second longer than it should have, and the air between us felt charged. Neither of us spoke, but the silence wasn't empty, it was thick with something unspoken, something I wasn't ready to name. The soft ripple of the water in the pool and the distant chirp of crickets were the only sounds around us, yet my heart pounded loud enough to drown them out. I shouldn't have said that. Michael finally broke the silence, his voice low and apologetic. But his eyes, those piercing eyes, didn't waver. It's okay, I whispered, though it wasn't. My thoughts were racing, my emotions a tangled mess of confusion and something dangerously close to excitement. What was I doing here? How had I let this get so far? He looked at the water, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the wooden chair. I don't know what's happening to me, he admitted. For years, I've lived a quiet life. Routine, predictable. And then you came along, and suddenly, the world feels alive again. His vulnerability caught me off guard. I'd expected smooth words, more of the charming confidence he always carried. But this was different. This was raw, unguarded. And it scared me because I felt it too, that undeniable pull, that thrill of something forbidden. Michael, I began, trying to summon the strength to put an end to this. But the way he looked at me, like I was the only person who mattered, stole the words from my lips. Let's not overthink this, he said softly, almost pleading. Just sit here with me. For a while. And so, I did. We sat in silence, side by side, as the stars stretched endlessly above us. But my mind was anything but quiet. Over the next few days, I tried to keep my distance. I told myself it was for the best, that a little space would clear my head and help me regain control. But Michael wasn't one to be ignored. He left small gifts on my porch, a book he thought I'd like, a potted plant with a note, a little life for your window. I should have been annoyed, but instead, I felt a strange warmth every time I saw his handwriting. It was like he knew exactly how to break through my defenses without even trying. Then, one evening, he called. His voice over the phone was as steady as always, but there was an edge of hesitation. I've been thinking about our night by the pool, he said. I'd like to invite you over again. Just for dinner. Nothing more. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the phone tightly. Every instinct told me to decline, to stay away. But my heart had other plans. Okay, I said, barely recognizing my own voice. That evening, his house was aglow with soft candlelight. He greeted me at the door with a smile that was equal parts nervous and hopeful. The table was set with meticulous care, 2 glasses of wine already poured. Is this too much? He asked, noticing my wide eyes. It's lovely, I managed, though my chest felt tight. The dinner was perfect, of course. He told stories that made me laugh, recounted memories that made my heart ache for him. But as the evening wore on, the mood shifted. The air grew heavier, the pauses in our conversation longer. When the meal was over, he leaned back in his chair, studying me intently. You've been quiet tonight, he said. What's on your mind? I hesitated. How could I put into words the storm of emotions I'd been wrestling with? Instead, I deflected. It's just everything feels so surreal. He nodded, as if he understood completely. It does, doesn't it? He stood and offered his hand. Come with me. I hesitated, but eventually placed my hand in his. He led me outside, back to the pool where we'd sat that fateful night. The water shimmered under the starlight, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine. I want to show you something, he said, pulling a small remote from his pocket. With the press of a button, soft lights illuminated the water, casting a mesmerizing glow. I've always found this place calming. It's where I go when I need to think. It's beautiful, I whispered, unable to take my eyes off the reflection of the stars dancing on the surface. I thought you might like it, he said, his voice closer now. I turned to find him standing just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. I shouldn't be here, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Why not? He asked, his tone gentle but firm. Because of what people might think? Because of what you think? I opened my mouth to reply, but found I didn't have an answer. He stepped closer, his gaze steady. I know this is complicated. I know it's not easy. But I also know that what I feel for you is real. And I think you feel it too. My breath hitched. He was too close, his presence overwhelming. Michael, this is... Say it, he interrupted softly. Say what you're afraid of. I looked at him, my chest tightening. I'm afraid of losing myself, I admitted. Of crossing a line I can't come back from. He nodded, his expression softening. I understand. And I would never want to push you. But if you're willing to take that step, I'll be here. Always. The sincerity in his voice was almost unbearable. I wanted to run, to escape the intensity of the moment. But instead, I stayed. Come on, he said, his voice lighter now. Let's take a swim. What? I asked, laughing despite myself. Why not? He said, kicking off his shoes. The water's perfect. Before I could protest, he was in the pool, his laughter echoing in the quiet night. You're crazy, I called after him. Maybe, he replied, grinning. But life's too short to play it safe. I hesitated, the weight of everything still pressing down on me. But then, I took a deep breath and let it go. One step at a time, I walked to the edge of the pool. And jumped. As the water enveloped me, cool and refreshing, I felt an unexpected sense of freedom. When I surfaced, Michael was there, his smile soft and genuine. See, he said. Not so bad. I laughed, the sound surprising even myself. Not bad at all. We swam for what felt like hours, the world outside fading into nothingness. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't overthinking, wasn't second-guessing. I was just there, in the moment, with him. But as the night wore on, the tension returned, stronger than ever. We weren't just swimming. We were towing a line, one that neither of us dared to cross, yet. As I climbed out of the pool, dripping and breathless, Michael handed me a towel. His hand brushed mine, and the spark between us was undeniable. Stay, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, my heart pounding. And in that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur of thoughts and emotions I couldn't escape. Michael lingered in my mind constantly, his words, his gaze, the unspoken tension between us. I tried to act as though nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew it had. He had become a part of my life, a part one wasn't ready to share with anyone. One evening, just as I was settling into a routine I desperately clung to, my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen, and my heart skipped a beat. I've planned something special for tonight. Come over, Michael said. His voice was warm, with a hint of mystery. Michael, I don't think, I started, but he interrupted me gently. You'll regret it if you don't. Trust me. There was a confidence in his tone that made it impossible to refuse. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When I arrived, his house looked almost magical. Soft candlelight flickered through the windows, and a warm glow lit up the area near the pool. Michael met me at the door, holding 2 glasses of champagne. You look stunning, he said, his eyes scanning me with an intensity that made me blush. I glanced toward the pool, where a small table was set with champagne, fruit, and what looked like hours of careful planning. It was elegant and intimate, too intimate. What's all this? I asked, trying to sound casual despite the fluttering in my chest. Just a night for us, he said simply, his smile both reassuring and disarming. No distractions. No rules. We sat by the pool, the cool evening air wrapping around us as we sipped champagne and talked. He told me stories from his life, moments of joy and loss, dreams he once had and ones he still clung to. I listened, captivated, as the space between us seemed to shrink with every word. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Have you ever swum naked under the stars? I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him right. What? He smiled, a mischievous glint in his eye. It's one of life's simplest pleasures. You should try it. I laughed nervously. You're not serious. Oh, I am, he said, standing and beginning to unbutton his shirt. His movements were calm, deliberate, and confident. Michael, I protested, though my voice lacked conviction. Relax, he said, tossing his shirt onto a nearby chair. The water's perfect, and the stars are waiting. Trust me, you won't regret it. I hesitated, torn between reason and the pull of the moment. But then he stepped into the pool, the water rippling around him as he turned to face me. Your turn, he said, his voice low and inviting. My heart raced as I stood. Every rational thought told me to walk away, to keep this boundary intact. But something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge, pushed me forward. Slowly, I slipped out of my dress, feeling the cool night air against my skin. Michael's gaze was steady, but he didn't move. He simply waited. When I stepped into the water, it was warm, enveloping me like an embrace. I let out a soft laugh, the absurdity of the situation washing over me. The night took on an almost surreal quality. We swam under the stars, splashing and laughing like children, the weight of the world forgotten. But beneath the laughter was a tension that grew with every passing second. At one point, Michael swam closer, his movements slow and deliberate. When he stopped just inches away, the air between us felt electric. You're incredible, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hope you know that. His words hit me harder than they should have. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Instead, I looked at him, my breath catching as his hand brushed mine under the water. This is crazy, I said, my voice trembling. Maybe, he replied, his gaze unwavering. But does it feel wrong? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was a line I shouldn't cross, but the pull was too strong. Before I could think better of it, he reached up, his hand gently cupping my face. His touch was warm, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I can stop, he said, his voice soft but steady. Just say the word. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I leaned in, closing the space between us. When his lips met mine, it was as though the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as though we were testing the waters. But it deepened quickly, and in that moment, there was no room for doubt or fear. When we finally pulled apart, the reality of what had just happened hit me like a wave. I looked at him, his face calm but filled with emotion, and I knew there was no turning back. Come inside, he said, taking my hand and leading me out of the pool. The warmth of the house was a sharp contrast to the cool night air. Candles still flickered on the table, casting a golden glow over the room. Michael handed me a towel, his fingers brushing against mine, sending another jolt of electricity through me. We didn't speak as we dried off, the silence between us charged with anticipation. When he reached for my hand again, I didn't resist. The water shimmered around us, catching the faint glow of the stars above. Michael floated closer, his movements calm but deliberate. My heart raced as I felt the space between us shrink. You're the most beautiful thing that's ever happened to me, he said, his voice quiet but firm. His words carried a weight I couldn't ignore, and the sincerity in his eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. The tension between us was almost unbearable now, an invisible thread pulling us closer. Before I could think better of it, his hand reached out, gently brushing against my cheek. I froze, my breath catching as he leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. But it didn't stay that way. The hesitation melted, replaced by something deeper, something unstoppable. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping tightly as the world around us disappeared. As the kiss deepened, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, desire, exhilaration. This was wrong. It had to be. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the warmth of his touch and the way he made me feel seen, understood, alive. When we finally broke apart, I couldn't look at him. My cheeks burned with both shame and something I couldn't quite name. Michael, I whispered, my voice trembling. I know, he said, his hand still resting lightly on my shoulder. I know this is complicated, but it doesn't feel wrong to me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away, my thoughts a chaotic mess. But even as I tried to put distance between us, I felt his presence like a magnet, drawing me back. We swam in silence for a while after that, the tension between us unspoken but palpable. I kept telling myself this had to stop, that I had to draw the line. But then he spoke again. Do you ever wonder why the universe brings certain people into your life? He asked, his voice soft but steady. I turned to him, confused. What do you mean? Meeting you, he said, moving closer again. It wasn't random. It couldn't have been. You've brought something into my life I didn't even realize I was missing. His words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to dismiss them, to brush them off as nothing more than the ramblings of an old man. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I felt it too. Michael, this is complicated, I said, my voice barely audible. Life is complicated, he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the things that make it worth living. By the time we climbed out of the pool, the air between us had shifted. The line we'd been towing all night felt thinner, more fragile. As I wrapped a towel around myself, I caught his gaze. There was no mistaking the emotion there, tenderness, longing, and something deeper I wasn't ready to name. You should probably head home, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I nodded, but my feet didn't move. Instead, I stood there, staring at him, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Finally, I spoke. Michael, I don't know what I'm doing anymore, I admitted, my voice cracking. Us, it's not something I ever imagined. Neither did I, he said, stepping closer. But does that mean it's wrong? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I let him take my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. The night didn't end there. We sat by the edge of the pool, wrapped in our towels, talking about everything and nothing. The vulnerability in his voice, the honesty in his words, it was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. At one point, he reached out, tucking a strand of wet hair behind my ear. The gesture was simple, almost innocent, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. You deserve to be happy, he said quietly. Truly happy. And what about you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. I'm happiest when I'm with you. As the night wore on, the pull between us became impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch, every word felt charged with unspoken emotion. By the time we stood to leave, I knew there was no going back. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice soft but steady. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to walk away. But my heart had already made its decision. I'm sure, I said, my voice trembling but firm. As we walked back into his house, the warmth of the room enveloped me, a stark contrast to the cool night air outside. The scent of candles and champagne lingered in the air, mingling with something deeper, anticipation, maybe even inevitability. Michael turned to me, his expression unreadable. You can still change your mind, he said, his voice low. I won't hold it against you. But I didn't want to change my mind. Not anymore. I'm here, I said simply. He nodded, his eyes softening. Then let's not waste this moment. Wrapped in towels, we stepped into his dimly lit bedroom. The scent of champagne and the faint, lingering aroma of the candles created a cocoon around us, isolating us from the rest of the world. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a steady rhythm that only grew louder as Michael turned to face me. He didn't say anything at first. His eyes searched mine, soft and filled with something I couldn't describe, something between admiration and longing. I felt exposed, not because of the towel draped loosely around me, but because of the way he saw me. Fully. Completely. I want you to be sure, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I've never been more sure about anything, I replied, though my voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. He reached out, his fingers brushing against my wrist, and the warmth of his touch sent a shiver up my spine. Slowly, his hand moved to my shoulder, lingering there as if asking for permission. I didn't pull away. The room felt impossibly quiet. Every small movement, every shift of fabric, seemed magnified. When he leaned closer, I could feel his breath against my skin. My heart raced, but I didn't want him to stop. His hand trailed lightly down my arm, and the softness of his touch was both electrifying and comforting. For a moment, I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the sensation. The doubts, the fears, the voices in my head, they all faded away, leaving only the two of us. I've waited so long to feel this alive, he said softly, his voice trembling just slightly. His words broke something inside me. The walls I'd been building for days, weeks, maybe even years, came crashing down. I reached out, my hand finding his, and the connection was immediate, undeniable. He guided me gently to the edge of the bed, his movements slow, deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency, only the steady, unspoken understanding that this was inevitable. He let his towel drop first, his confidence somehow both intimidating and reassuring. I followed suit, my hands trembling slightly as I let go of the last barrier between us. As I sat down, he knelt in front of me, his hands resting lightly on my knees. His touch was firm but tender, grounding me in the moment. "You're extraordinary," he said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it. I couldn't find the words to respond, so instead, I reached for him. The world seemed to tilt as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. Every touch, every breath, felt like a promise, one I wasn't sure either of us could keep but desperately wanted to. What happened next didn't feel rushed or chaotic. It felt like time had stopped, like the universe had folded in on itself to leave just the two of us. Every barrier that had once stood between us, age, fear, societal judgment, disintegrated in the face of what we'd both been holding back for so long. It was gentle. It was intense. It was everything I didn't know I needed. And when it was over, we lay there in the silence, our breaths slowly sinking, the world outside feeling distant and unreal. His hand rested on mine, his thumb tracing lazy circles on my skin. I didn't want to move, didn't want to break the fragile peace we'd created. But peace never lasts, does it? As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, reality began to seep back in. I glanced at him, his face peaceful in the soft glow of morning, and my heart ached. I didn't regret what had happened, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. "I should go," I said quietly, my voice breaking the stillness. He opened his eyes, his expression soft but knowing. "I wish you didn't have to," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. I smiled weakly, leaning down to press my forehead against his. "I'll be back," I promised, though the weight of the world outside these walls made the words feel fragile. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts were chaotic, tangled with both elation and dread. I couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind, the way he'd looked at me, touched me, made me feel like I was the only person who mattered. But the moment I stepped through my front door, reality hit me like a freight train. My phone buzzed on the counter. I picked it up without thinking, my stomach dropping when I saw my mother's name on the screen. "What are you doing?" Her voice was sharp, trembling with anger. "I know about him. About what you've been doing." I froze, the blood draining from my face. How did she know? Had someone seen us? Had Michael said something? "This is wrong," she continued, her voice growing louder. "Do you have any idea what people are saying? What this will do to you, to us?" I couldn't respond. The shame, the fear, it all came crashing down at once. But then I thought of Michael, the way he'd held me, the way he'd looked at me like I was worth fighting for. "I love him," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "And I don't care what anyone else thinks." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, quietly, my mother said, "You're going to regret this." Her words lingered long after the call ended, but they didn't change how I felt. That night with Michael had been more than just a moment of passion. It had been a turning point, a realization that some things are worth the risk, no matter the consequences. As I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the phone in my hands, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The world wouldn't understand, and the road ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time in my life, I felt certain about one thing. This love was worth it.